Every plantation had its rules. Every overseer had his list. Every slave knew exactly where they were permitted to stand, to breathe, to exist, and where they were not. But on the Hargrove estate in Beaufort County, South Carolina, there was one man who seemed to exist outside those rules entirely. One man who moved through the night like a shadow that belonged to no one. One man the overseers allowed to walk the property after dark without question, without escort, without explanation. His name was Elias. And for 11 years, not a single soul on that plantation truly understood why he was given that freedom. Not until the summer of 1859, when a ledger was found buried beneath the floorboards of the main house, and everything that had seemed like privilege revealed itself to be something far more sinister. Before we continue with the story of Elias and the Hargrove estate, if you're new here, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. We'd also love to know, from which state or city are you listening right now? Drop it in the comments. Now, let's go back to Beaufort County, to a night that never should have been forgotten. Beaufort County in the late 1840s was a world unto itself. Bordered by salt marshes and rivers that moved like dark glass under the Carolina sun, it was one of the wealthiest regions in the entire American South. Not because of its soil alone, but because of what had been built upon it across generations of forced labor. Sea Island cotton grew there in long, pale rows that stretched to the horizon, and the men who owned those fields had names that appeared in newspapers from Charleston to Washington with the confidence of people who believed their position in the world was permanent. The Hargrove family was among the oldest and most established in the county. Their estate, some 400 acres of cultivated land, plus a tract of forested marsh, had been in the family since 1791. When Thomas Hargrove's grandfather had obtained a land grant following the Revolutionary War. By the time the 1840s arrived, the Hargroves were not merely landowners, they were a kind of institution. Their word carried weight in county courts. Their invitations to seasonal dinners were declined at social peril. The patriarch in those years was Cornelius Hargrove, a man in his mid-50s, wide-shouldered, with a deliberate manner of speaking that made even simple statements feel final. He was not, by the standards of his era and class, considered cruel. His neighbors would have described him as firm, reasonable, a man who managed his property with precision and expected the same from everyone beneath his roof. He kept meticulous records. He tracked rainfall and harvest yields. He logged the names of enslaved people who arrived and departed, those who were born and those who died, in the same leather-bound books where he tracked the price of cotton. His wife, Eleanor Hargrove, was 12 years younger than her husband, a woman of considerable quiet intelligence who managed the household with an efficiency that guests frequently remarked upon. She was known for her embroidery, her precise handwriting, and a habit of never speaking unless she had something worth saying. She had grown up on a neighboring plantation, the daughter of a man whose debts had quietly consumed most of his estate by the time she came of age, and her marriage to Cornelius had been, in the way of those arrangements, an exchange of social standing for financial security. They had 2 children who survived infancy. The elder was a son named Henry, 21 years old in 1848, and recently returned from 2 years of study in Charleston. The younger was a daughter, Nora, 16 at the time, who had not yet been sent away for formal schooling and still spent her mornings helping her mother catalogue household items and her afternoons reading in the narrow room behind the kitchen garden that she called, without irony, her library. The estate employed 6 white overseers who managed various sections of the property. It held, as of the 1848 census records, 63 enslaved people. Among them was Elias. He had arrived at the Hargrove Plantation in 1847, purchased at auction in Savannah, Georgia, though the auction record, like so many of its kind, contained only the barest facts. Age estimated at 28, occupation listed as general field labor, origin unknown. He had been brought to Beaufort County, along with 2 other men whose names the records show, but whose fates diverged sharply from his almost immediately upon arrival. What distinguished Elias from the beginning was something no ledger column could properly capture. He was quiet in a way that made people pay attention. Not the silence of a man who had been broken. Those who had seen enough of plantation life could recognize that silence from a distance, like a particular quality of stillness in a body that has stopped expecting anything. Elias was quiet in the manner of a man who was always listening, always calculating. His eyes moved across a room before the rest of him followed. The overseers noticed. They noted it in the way men like that notice anything that departs from the expected. Not with open acknowledgement, but with a shift in behavior. They watched him more carefully in the first months. They positioned themselves nearby when he spoke to other enslaved workers. They searched for the thing that would explain the quality he had, the particular gravity. They never quite found it. What they found instead was that Elias worked without complaint, that he never required a second instruction, that he never appeared in any record as a source of disruption or defiance. He was, on the surface, exactly what the men who managed such places wanted a person to be, and so, over time, the watching relaxed. The moment that changed everything, not the discovery beneath the floorboards, that would come later, much later. But the first moment, the one that set everything else in motion, came in the early autumn of 1847, just a few months after Elias arrived. It was a September night, warm and humid in the way that Beaufort County nights could be even as the season turned, when one of the overseers, a man named Bertram Voss, who had worked the Hargrove property for 6 years, found Elias standing at the edge of the cotton fields at 3 a.m. Voss had come out because he heard something, a low sound that he would later describe, somewhat imprecisely, as singing. Not singing exactly, he would tell the other overseers the next day. Something quieter, like a man rehearsing words he had memorized so thoroughly they no longer required full voice. What Voss found was Elias standing perfectly still at the boundary between the last cotton row and the tree line, facing east, speaking in a voice barely above a whisper. The night was clear. Moonlight made the white bolls of cotton look like something phosphorescent, and the trees behind Elias were black and motionless. Voss put his hand on the pistol he carried at his hip. He called out. Elias turned without haste. He looked at Voss the way a man looks at something he has already accounted for. He did not run. He did not speak until Voss was close enough to see his face clearly. Couldn't sleep, Elias said. Voss studied him for a long moment. He would later say that he was prepared to bring Elias back to the quarters by force if necessary, that the standard response to any enslaved person found outside at night without permission was immediate restraint and a report to the overseer-in-chief by morning. That was the rule. That was what the rule was for. But Elias said something else before Voss could act. He said quietly, and with a directness that Voss would recount to anyone who asked for years afterward, "I know something about the Henderson account." Voss went very still. The Henderson account was not a matter of public record on the Hargrove estate. It was not something a field laborer should have known existed. It was the name attached to a private financial arrangement that Cornelius Hargrove had entered into 3 years prior. An arrangement that involved a competitor's stolen crop yields, falsified correspondence, and a sum of money that had changed hands in ways that several people in Beaufort County's mercantile community would have found highly irregular. It was the kind of account whose name, spoken aloud by the wrong person, could do considerable damage. Voss did not bring Elias back to the quarters that night. He walked him to the main house and woke Cornelius Hargrove. What passed between Elias and Cornelius in that parlor, in those early morning hours of September 1847, was never witnessed by anyone else. The windows were shuttered. The household was asleep. The conversation lasted approximately 2 hours, according to the single detail that Eleanor Hargrove recorded in her personal diary, that her husband came to bed just before 5 in the morning smelling of whiskey and did not speak until the following afternoon. What followed, over the weeks and months after that night, was a change that every person on the Hargrove estate could observe, but no one could explain. Elias was moved from the field labor quarters to a small outbuilding closer to the main house, a structure that had previously been used for storing tools and tack. The building was cleaned out. A cot and a lantern were placed inside, and Elias was given, with no announcement and no stated reason, permission to move through the property at night. The overseers were told simply that Mr. Hargrove had a specific use for Elias, and that the usual rules of movement did not apply to him between dusk and dawn. They were told this by Cornelius himself. In the flat and finality-laden way he told people things that were not for discussion. No one asked further questions. Not immediately. But everyone watched. The first winter after Elias received his night privileges passed without notable incident, at least on the surface. The cotton was harvested. The price held. Cornelius Hargrove made 2 trips to Charleston and returned each time with a satisfied expression that his wife recognized as the face he wore when business had gone according to plan. Elias, for his part, conducted himself with the same measured quietness he had always shown. He performed tasks during daylight hours that were never clearly categorized. Sometimes near the house, sometimes in the fields, sometimes at the edge of the property where the land met the tidal marsh. The overseers learned to note his movements in the margins of their daily logs with brief, almost dismissive notations. Elias at the marsh again. Elias near the north fence this morning. What none of them wrote down, because none of them fully understood what they were seeing, was that Elias was building something. Not physically, not in any way that left obvious marks on the landscape. What Elias was building, with the patience and precision of a man who had learned very early that survival required a particular kind of long sight, was a map. It took several years for the people around him to begin to understand this. And even then, the understanding came in fragments, through observations that only made sense when placed beside each other. But the picture that emerged, slowly and only in retrospect, was this. Elias had been somewhere else before the Hargrove Plantation. He had lived, at some point in the years before 1847, among people who had taught him things that had no obvious place in the life of a field laborer on a sea island cotton plantation. He read, "This was not, in itself, impossible for an enslaved person in the antebellum South, despite the laws in South Carolina that made teaching enslaved people to read a punishable offense. There were always exceptions. House servants who had been taught by sympathetic families, men who had worked in cities where the lines were more permeable, individuals who had taught themselves through fragments and determination. But Elias did not merely read with the labored concentration of someone who had pieced the skill together in stolen moments. He read the way a person reads when they have been doing it for years, fluidly, with retention. Nora Hargrove was the first person in the household to discover this, and she was 16 when it happened, which meant she understood almost immediately that she should not tell her father. She had gone to the tool-out building on an afternoon in March of 1849 to retrieve a length of twine that one of the house servants had left there, and she had opened the door without announcing herself. Elias was sitting on his cot with a document in his hands, a single sheet of paper, folded and refolded so many times that the creases had begun to wear through. He looked up when she entered. She saw what he was holding. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Nora Hargrove said, in a voice that was much steadier than she later remembered it being, "I won't tell." She left without the twine. What she had seen on that paper, the small, precise columns of text, the quality of the handwriting, she spent the following weeks turning over in her mind with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle for which they have not yet identified the correct question. She had grown up surrounded by enslaved people. She had eaten food they prepared, worn clothing they laundered, been rocked to sleep as an infant by a woman named Clara, whose face she could still see clearly in her memory. She was not without the capacity for empathy that proximity sometimes generates. But she had also grown up understanding, in the specific way that white children of privilege understand things they have never had to articulate, that the world had a particular order, and that her position in it was built on that order remaining undisturbed. What she had seen in Elias's hand suggested that Elias had a life she knew nothing about. A history, an interior world of sufficient complexity that it required documentation. She began to leave books near the outbuilding, not prominently, not in ways that a casual observer would notice. A volume left on the bench beside the water pump, a pamphlet tucked beneath a clay pot near the building's door. She never acknowledged these placements, and neither did Elias. But the books would disappear, and when she passed him in the yard or in the field, something in the quality of his attention, a slight inclination of the head, a fractional shift in the set of his shoulders, communicated without words that they had been received. Henry Hargrove noticed none of this. Henry, at 22, was occupied with the process of becoming his father, attending to the business of the estate with the combination of entitlement and anxiety that belongs to men who have inherited something large and are not entirely certain they deserve it. He managed the overseers with brisk authority, rode the property lines on horseback most mornings, and kept company with the sons of neighboring plantation families on weekends when they gathered at one house or another to drink and talk with the expansive confidence of men whose futures seemed secured. He did not notice Elias except as a presence on the property that his father had sanctioned, which was sufficient endorsement for Henry. What Henry did notice, and what he mentioned to his father in a conversation that Eleanor Hargrove overheard from the adjacent room in the spring of 1850, was that 2 neighboring properties had recently experienced what the overseer community was calling night irregularities, men missing from quarters, paths through the marsh that showed signs of recent use. One instance, on the Davenport farm 8 miles north, of a fire in a storage barn whose origin was never formally explained. Cornelius Hargrove listened to his son's recitation of these incidents in silence. Then he said, and Eleanor would write this down in her diary that night, almost verbatim, "That is not our concern. Our people are accounted for." Henry accepted this without comment. Eleanor sat in the adjacent room and listened to her husband's certainty and thought about the fact that she had begun over the past year to wonder about Elias herself. By 1852, Elias had been walking the Hargrove property at night for 5 years. The habit of the overseers toward him had settled into something that resembled routine, a resigned acknowledgement of an arrangement none of them had created and none of them quite understood. They logged his nighttime presence in the margins of their books and did not interfere. Bertram Voss, who had been the one to find him that first night at the field's edge, had developed a habit of simply turning away when he spotted Elias in the dark, and had never fully articulated, even to himself, whether this was compliance, avoidance, or something closer to unease. The other enslaved people on the property were more complicated in their relationship to him. There were those who regarded Elias with open suspicion. The latitude he had been given, the freedom of movement, the separate housing, the undefined relationship with the master of the estate was, by any measure, irregular. And in places where survival depended on understanding every variation in the social landscape, the irregular was not generally a source of comfort. There were whispers that Elias was an informant, that his nighttime walks were a kind of surveilling, that the permission he had been given was conditional on his reporting what he heard, what was said in the quarters after dark, what plans or grievances circulated among the men and women who had no other private hours. There were others who thought differently. Among them was a woman named Ruth, who had been on the Hargrove estate since childhood, and who, at 43, had survived enough to have developed a particular calibration for danger versus possibility. She watched Elias over the years with the same careful attention she gave to changes in weather and to the moods of overseers, not with fear exactly, but with a form of patient readiness. She did not speak to him directly about what she suspected for a long time. She waited. The moment she chose to approach him was in the summer of 1852, on a Sunday afternoon, the one day of the week when the pressure of work relaxed enough that conversations could occur without the geometry of observation bearing down on them. She found him near the marsh, at the edge of the property where the grasses were high and the sound of the water covered voices. "You're counting things," she said without preamble. Elias looked at her for a long moment. The marsh moved behind him. "I've been watching you for 5 years," Ruth said. "You count the distances, the time it takes to walk from here to the north fence, how long the dogs take to circle back, how deep the water gets in the channel when the tide is coming in." He did not deny it. What Ruth understood, and what she had been testing in her own way for years, was whether Elias was building something for himself or for others, whether the information he collected in those nighttime hours was being given to Cornelius Hargrove or kept for a different purpose entirely. She had reached her conclusion before she spoke to him. The approach itself was the test. If he reported this conversation to the house, she would know. She had calculated the risk and decided it was one she could take. What Elias told her that afternoon, in fragments and with the specific caution of a man who had learned to communicate important things in minimally exposed ways, was not everything. But it was enough for Ruth to understand that the arrangement with Cornelius Hargrove was not what the overseers believed it to be. The Henderson account, the financial irregularity that had given Elias his leverage in that first September night conversation, was not Elias's only piece of knowledge about Cornelius Hargrove. It was the opening bid. Over the years that followed, Elias had accumulated, with the methodical patience of someone conducting a long and careful survey, additional information, additional accounts, additional facts about the Hargrove family's financial dealings, their correspondence with business partners, the particulars of certain transactions that had occurred between Cornelius and a factor in Charleston named Dutton. He had not gathered this information by reading documents directly, though he was capable of it. He had gathered it by listening, by being in the right places at the right times, by understanding that people in positions of authority become careless around those they have decided do not matter. Cornelius Hargrove spoke freely in the presence of his enslaved household staff, in the same way that men who keep secrets always leave themselves a gap, a place where the maintenance of their public self relaxes, because they believe the audience is not truly there. Elias had been in that gap for 5 years. What Ruth asked him, after he had told her enough that her suspicions had been confirmed, was simple. "What are you building with it?" And Elias, for the first time in the conversation, something in his expression shifted from the careful neutrality he wore like a garment into something else, something that Ruth, who had been reading human faces all her life, recognized as the face of a man who has been walking a very long road for a very long time and has finally reached a place where he can say something true out loud. "A door," he said. "I'm building a door." This was the beginning of something that would take 7 more years to complete. What Elias meant by a door, and what it would cost him and everyone connected to him before it was finished, was not something Ruth fully understood until much later. But she understood enough to keep his secret, and she understood, in the particular way that experience teaches certain things, that whatever Elias was planning, its execution would require everything he had and a great deal he had not yet acquired. Over the next few years, the pattern of life on the Hargrove estate continued in its visible form, much as it had before. The cotton grew and was harvested. The overseers kept their logs. Henry Hargrove took over more of the day-to-day management of the property from his aging father. Nora Hargrove, at 20 in 1852, began to attract suitors from neighboring families and eventually entered into a courtship with a young man from Colleton County whose family owned indigo fields. And Elias walked at night. But something had changed. Slowly, quietly, in the margins of the observable world, the information Elias was gathering was no longer staying only with him. The first sign that something had shifted in the arrangement between Elias and Cornelius Hargrove came in the late spring of 1855. Cornelius was 60 years old by then, and the years had begun to accumulate in the visible ways they do. A thickening in the joints, a slowing of his already deliberate pace, a tendency toward long silences at the dinner table that Eleanor recognized as something other than reflection. His business had changed as well. The cotton market in those years was volatile, and the Hargroves had weathered 2 consecutive difficult seasons. Henry, to his credit, had managed the property's accounts with competence, but the margin of comfort that Cornelius had once maintained had narrowed. In June of 1855, Cornelius summoned Elias to the main house at an unusual time, mid-morning, on a weekday, with the household fully active. He brought him to the study on the second floor, a room that smelled of tobacco and old paper, and was lined with exactly the kind of documents that Elias had spent 8 years learning to read and catalogue in the private record of his memory. Eleanor, passing the closed door, heard voices. She could not make out words. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. When Elias emerged, she saw him in the upstairs hallway for a moment before he descended, and what she noticed, and what she would write in her diary that same night, in language more guarded than her earlier entries, was that he did not look like a man who had just received instructions. He looked like a man who had just confirmed something he already knew. The change in Cornelius's behavior that followed the June meeting was subtle but not imperceptible to someone who paid the right kind of attention. He began spending more time in his study. He requested that certain correspondence be brought to him directly, rather than sorted through his son. He made a trip to Charleston in August, alone, without informing Henry in advance, and returned 3 days later with no explanation beyond business. What Eleanor did not yet know, and what would not become clear until the ledger was found 4 years later, was that Cornelius had entered into a second arrangement with Elias in June 1855. The first had been the original exchange, Elias's knowledge of the Henderson account for the latitude to move at night. The second was something more structural, more dangerous for both of them. Elias had come to Cornelius in that June meeting not to be summoned, but to present something, to make a proposal. What the proposal was exactly is a matter of inference and reconstruction from documents that survived and documents that didn't, but the outlines are recoverable. Elias had spent 8 years collecting information about Cornelius Hargrove's financial affairs. He had also spent 8 years walking the tidal marsh and the property lines at night, and in that time he had developed a thorough knowledge of something that was extremely valuable and extremely illegal in South Carolina in 1855. The routes through the marsh, the shallow crossings of the river to the north, the specific patterns of patrol and absence on neighboring properties, the timing of boats that moved through the coastal waterways after dark. He had not merely been mapping the Hargrove property, he had been mapping the entire network of terrain and timing that lay between Beaufort County and the coastal channels that led, eventually circuitously, with the right knowledge and the right contacts, north. The word that was never spoken aloud in the study that June morning was passage. But it was present in every sentence of the conversation, the way certain words are present in rooms without being uttered. What Elias proposed to Cornelius was this: that in exchange for Cornelius's continued silence and continued access, Elias would continue to provide Cornelius with information, not about the enslaved workers on the property, not as an informant, but about competitors, about the financial dealings of the neighboring families whose business intersected with Cornelius's own. He had, in 8 years of being invisible in the margins of his master's world, accumulated far more than the Henderson account. He had become, without anyone fully realizing it, a repository of information that a man in Cornelius Hargrove's position could find genuinely useful. Cornelius, at 60, looking at narrowed margins and aging joints and the particular uncertainty of a man whose world is beginning to feel less solid than it once did, accepted. The arrangement that had begun as leverage became something stranger and harder to name. Elias continued to walk at night. Cornelius continued to ask no questions. And the information flowed in both directions, facts about local business dealings flowing upward to Cornelius, and something else entirely flowing in fragments through the marsh at night and into the wider world beyond the Hargrove property. Ruth knew. By 1855 there were 3 others on the property who knew as well. All of them women, a choice that was not accidental. Women were watched differently. Their movements were tracked with different assumptions. The particular geography of the enslaved household had, over generations, created zones of relative invisibility for women that men did not have access to in the same way. Elias understood this. The thing that the 3 women knew, what they held in the careful compartments of their daily existence, carrying it the way people carry knowledge that is both precious and dangerous, was that people had been moving through the Hargrove property at night for at least 2 years. Not Hargrove enslaved people. Not yet. People from other properties, from further inland, following routes that Elias had spent 8 years making safe enough to be usable. He had not been building a door for himself. He had been building a door for anyone who needed it. It was in October of 1857 that the first thing went wrong. The trouble did not begin on the Hargrove property. It began 8 miles away, on the Davenport farm, the same property where the unexplained barn fire had occurred in 1850, where an overseer named Garner made an observation that he chose to act on rather than report through the usual channels. He had been watching a particular section of the marsh for 3 weeks. He had noticed patterns in the grasses, compressions that recurred at specific intervals, evidence, to a man who knew what he was looking at, of regular foot traffic through a supposedly impassable section of tidal wetland. Garner was not an intelligent man in most respects, but he had been working plantation land in Beaufort County for 20 years, and he knew the marsh the way such men know the tools of their trade. He did not go to the Davenport family with his suspicion. He went to another overseer, a man named Prewitt, who worked a property 1 mile from the Hargrove estate, and the 2 of them spent a week in discussion before they went anywhere else with it. What they decided was not to inform their respective employers. What they decided was to watch the marsh at night themselves, on 2 consecutive nights in the 2nd week of October, and see what they found. On the first night, they found nothing. On the second, they found a trail. Not a person. A trail. Broken grass. Still fresh. The impression of a foot in soft mud at the edge of the marsh that was too large to be a deer, and too deliberate in its placement to be the casual movement of wildlife. And at the end of the trail, where it reached the firmer ground near the Hargrove property boundary, a small object pressed into the mud beside a particular tree that both men separately recognized as a marker. A piece of knotted cord. The specific pattern of the knot was something neither Garner nor Prewitt had seen before, but it had the unmistakable quality of intentionality. It had been placed there for someone who knew how to read it. They took it. They separated. And both of them spent the following days turning over what they had found and what it might mean, each of them understanding, with different degrees of clarity, that they had come across something considerably larger than a single person moving through a marsh. Prewitt went to his employer. Garner did not. Instead, Garner went back to the marsh alone, 3 days later. And this time he positioned himself better, arrived earlier, and waited. He waited for 4 hours, and then, just before 2 in the morning on a Wednesday night in late October 1857, he saw Elias, not crossing the marsh, walking the boundary, checking, with the unhurried competence of someone performing a routine, the line of the Hargrove property where it met the tidal grass, stopping at certain points, looking, adjusting something. Garner could not see clearly enough to know what, and moving on. Garner recognized him. He had seen Elias on the roads near the Hargrove property during daylight hours enough times to know his face. And he knew, from the overseer community's general knowledge, that Elias was the man on the Hargrove estate who had unusual night privileges. He did not confront Elias. He watched. He followed at a distance for a portion of the circuit and then let him go because he needed to think. What Garner thought over the next 2 weeks was that he had found something that had a value, not as a duty to report. He was not especially invested in duty, but as a commodity, as information, as the kind of thing that, handled correctly, was worth considerably more than his current wages. He went to Cornelius Hargrove directly. The meeting between Garner and Cornelius Hargrove occurred on a Monday morning in November 1857 at the gate of the main house drive. Because Cornelius, who had been informed by a house servant that a man from the Prewitt property was requesting an audience, chose to receive him outside rather than inside, which was itself a signal. Eleanor watched from an upstairs window without knowing who the man was. She saw her husband's posture go rigid within the first 30 seconds of the conversation. She saw Garner produce something from his coat pocket, small enough to hold in one hand, and saw Cornelius reach out and take it. She could not hear words from where she stood, but she had spent 30 years reading her husband's body, and what she read in the way he stood at the gate that November morning was not quite what she expected from a man receiving threatening information. It was something closer to a man who has been anticipating a particular knock on a particular door for a long time and has finally heard it. Cornelius thanked Garner, gave him a small sum of money, enough to suggest acknowledgement without suggesting fear, and sent him away. Then he went to find Elias. The conversation between them that followed was the second undocumented one, the second that took place without witnesses, behind closed doors, in the early hours of a November morning that the rest of the household slept through. It lasted longer than the first. Eleanor, who had been unable to sleep, heard the low murmur of voices from her husband's study past 3 in the morning and lay awake in the dark, listening to the sound of 2 men negotiating something she did not have words for yet. When Cornelius came to bed as the sky was beginning to lighten, he lay beside her without speaking for several minutes. Then he said, "Some things are going to change." She waited for more. More did not come. She lay beside him in the growing pale light and thought about the knotted cord, which she could not have known about, and about Elias, who she had been thinking about for 10 years, and about the particular quality of her husband's voice when he had said those 6 words, not afraid, not resolved, but something in between, something that sounded very faintly like relief. The ledger was found in March of 1859, not by Cornelius, not by Eleanor, not by Henry or by Nora, who had by then been married 2 years and lived in Colleton County. It was found by a new overseer, a young man named Aldous Crane, who had been hired in January of that year to replace Voss, who had departed the Hargrove property under circumstances that were described as personal and not explained further. Crane had been given a general tour of the outbuildings in his first week and had been told which structures he was responsible for and which were not his concern. The tool building where Elias had lived for 12 years was in the latter category, not his concern. He had been told this by Henry Hargrove, who had taken over full management of the estate the previous year following his father's declining health, and who had relayed the instruction about Elias with the specific firmness of someone repeating something he himself had been told and does not fully understand. Crane accepted the instruction for 6 weeks. He was 23, ambitious in the way of young men who feel they are being underutilized, and he had spent those 6 weeks observing the estate with the proprietary attention of someone who believes they are more competent than the people who are currently in charge. He noticed the tool building. He noticed that Elias moved through the property with a latitude that none of the other men had. He noticed on 2 separate nighttime checks of the grounds that Elias was not in his building. He asked about it. He was told again that Elias was not his concern. On a Thursday evening in the first week of March, while Elias was somewhere on the property's night circuit, Crane went to the tool building and searched it. What he found was not immediately legible to him. The space was spare: the cot, the lantern, a wooden box, a bundle of cloth. He opened the box. Inside were several folded documents, some scraps of paper with marks on them that he recognized as writing but could not entirely pass, and beneath these, wrapped in oilcloth and pushed to the bottom, a ledger. It was a small, worn ledger, the kind used for household accounts, and it was filled from front to back in a small, precise hand. On the first page at the top, a date, January 1848, and below it, organized in columns, a record. It was not a financial record. The columns did not track money. They tracked something else, something that it took Crane several minutes of close reading in the lantern light of that small building to begin to understand. Dates, locations, numbers, weather conditions, tide times. Something like a series of notations about the movement of people, not the enslaved people of the Hargrove estate. The notations had references that corresponded, to the extent Crane could tell, to places well outside the property boundary. The tidal channel, the northern crossing, a reference to a boat, a reference to a contact whose name was given only as a first initial. The ledger covered 11 years. Crane sat on the edge of Elias's cot for a long time. He was young and ambitious and not especially imaginative, but he was capable of following a clear line of implication. And the implication of what he was holding was, once the initial confusion resolved itself, absolutely unambiguous. He took the ledger and went to the main house. Henry Hargrove was not home. He had ridden to a neighbor's property that afternoon and was not expected until the following day. Eleanor Hargrove was alone in the parlor when Crane knocked, and she received him with the measured courtesy she gave everyone, and looked at the ledger he placed in her hands without changing her expression. She read the first page. She read several more. She did not speak while she read. When she finally closed the ledger and looked at Crane, she asked him one question. "Does anyone else know you have this?" He said no. She put the ledger in her lap and sat very still for a moment that Crane found difficult to interpret. Then she told him that she would need to speak with her husband in the morning, and that in the meantime he was to say nothing to anyone. Not to the other overseers, not to the workers, not to anyone. Crane left. Eleanor sat with the ledger in her lap until the parlor grew dark around her, and she had to light the lamp herself. What Eleanor Hargrove did that night has been pieced together from 3 separate sources. Her diary, a letter she wrote to her daughter Nora that was never sent and was found among Nora's papers decades later, and the account of Ruth, who was still on the Hargrove property in 1859, and who, of everyone, came closest to understanding what had happened. Eleanor read the entire ledger. It took her most of the night. What she found in it was not simply a record of routes and passages. It was a record of names. Not full names, initials in many cases or descriptive references. The man from Drayton's or 3 from Jennings, 2 women and 1 child. But it was a record nonetheless of individual human beings who had moved through the Hargrove property under cover of the night privileges granted to Elias, and who had gone somewhere, away. The ledger recorded, in its 11 years of small, careful columns, 112 people. Eleanor sat with this number for a long time. 112 people who had walked through her husband's property, through the marsh that she had looked at her entire married life without fully knowing what it contained, and gone north, gone away, gone somewhere that wasn't here. She thought about the conversation in which her husband had said some things are going to change, and she understood, sitting there in her parlor in the lamplight, that they had already changed, years ago, that she had been living inside a change without having been told it was happening. She thought about what Crane would do in the morning when he came back for his answer. She thought about what Henry would do when he came home. She thought about Elias, who was somewhere on the property at that moment, walking the circuit he had walked for 11 years. At some point past midnight, she rose from her chair, went to the window, and opened it. The night air came in warm and salt-smelling, the way Beaufort County nights always smelled when the tide was moving. She stood there for several minutes, Then she closed the window, went to her writing desk, and wrote a very short note. She sealed it. She went to the kitchen, where the cook slept in a room off the back, and she knocked on that door and gave the note to the woman who answered it. A woman named Ada, who had been in that kitchen for 20 years, and she said very quietly, "Give this to Elias when you see him." She did not say when, she did not say where. Ada took the note without a word, and Eleanor went back to the parlor and sat with the ledger until morning. What the note said has been inferred, but never confirmed. The note itself did not survive. What is known is that when Henry Hargrove came home the following afternoon and was confronted by Crane with the story of the previous night and the ledger, which Eleanor had given back to Crane that morning with the instruction that it be returned to where he found it, Henry went immediately to Cornelius. Cornelius was in his room, as he often was by then, confined by the ailments of his declining health to the bed and the chair beside it. Henry entered with the energy of a man who has just learned that the ground beneath his house has been quietly giving way. He spoke for 15 minutes, according to Eleanor's diary, with the door not entirely closed. Cornelius listened. When Henry finished, Cornelius was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Let it go." Henry did not let it go. Henry was not a man capable at that moment of letting anything go. He went to the county sheriff's office the following morning. But when the sheriff arrived at the Hargrove property on the afternoon of the day after that, and when Crane took him to the tool building, the building was empty. The cot, the lantern, the wooden box, the documents, all of it gone. Elias was gone. The investigation that followed was not extensive. The sheriff was a man named Lott, who had served Beaufort County for 14 years and who had, in that time, developed a practical relationship with the complexities of his jurisdiction. He interviewed Crane. He interviewed 2 of the other overseers. He did not, because it was not then customary, interview Eleanor Hargrove or Ruth or Ada or any of the other enslaved women on the property. He filed a report. The report noted that an enslaved man named Elias, property of the Hargrove estate, had absconded. His description was provided. His approximate age, estimated at 40, was noted. The circumstances of his disappearance were described in terms that mentioned the ledger only obliquely, as documents of uncertain origin that had been found in his possession. The Henderson account was not mentioned. The nature of the arrangement between Elias and Cornelius Hargrove was not mentioned. The 112 names were not mentioned. There was a notice placed in the Beaufort Gazette in the second week of March 1859. It ran for 3 weeks and was never answered. Elias was not found. Crane remained at the Hargrove property for another year, with the diminished standing of a man who had made a significant discovery and been maneuvered around by the people it implicated. He left in 1860 for reasons he did not explain and was not asked to explain. Cornelius Hargrove died in October of 1859, 7 months after Elias disappeared. The cause recorded in the county register was simply decline, the word used in that era as a kind of umbrella for the unspecific deterioration of old age. Eleanor was with him at the end. She did not record in her diary what his final days were like in any detail. The entries from that period are unusually brief: dates, weather, the ordinary logistics of a large household. On the night of his death, she wrote one sentence: "C passed at 10 minutes after 2. The marsh was very quiet. Henry Hargrove took full control of the estate in 1860 at 33 years old and managed it through the years that followed, including the Civil War, which arrived in Beaufort County with particular swiftness and finality." The Union Navy's capture of Port Royal Sound in November 1861 brought federal troops into the Sea Islands in the early months of the war, and the Hargrove family, along with most of the white plantation-owning families of Beaufort County, fled inland. They left behind the estate, the cotton, the outbuildings, and the enslaved people, who, in the weeks following the flight of the planters, found themselves in the extraordinary position of being the only people left on the land they had spent their lives working. Ruth was among those who stayed. She was 52 in 1861 and had nowhere else to go and no desire to follow the Hargroves anywhere. She stayed on the property through the Port Royal experiment, the federal government's effort to demonstrate that formerly enslaved people could manage the land and labor themselves. And she died in Beaufort County in 1874, 15 years after Elias disappeared, surrounded, according to the brief mention in a church record from that year, by family. Ada, the cook who had carried Eleanor's note across the dark kitchen in March of 1859, lived until 1881. She is listed in the 1870 and 1880 Freedmen's Census records as a resident of Beaufort County. She never spoke publicly about the events of that night, or if she did, it was not in any form that was written down. Eleanor Hargrove never returned to the Beaufort County property. She went to her daughter's home in Colleton County following her husband's death and remained there. She died in 1877. Her diary, 16 volumes covering the years 1835 to 1877, passed to Nora and was eventually deposited, in fragments and through a chain of descendants, with a historical collection in Columbia, South Carolina, where it remained largely unread for decades. The ledger was never found. Not by the sheriff in 1859, not by any subsequent investigation, not in the years after the war when the property changed hands repeatedly. Whatever it contained beyond what has been inferred, whatever fuller record Elias had maintained of those 11 years of careful, patient, nocturnal documentation, vanished with him. What the ledger was, in the end, was both more and less than the story that formed around it. It was not a supernatural document. It was not a manifesto. It was a practical record, kept by a practical man, of something that was happening with or without the ledger's existence. 112 people moved through the tidal marsh of Beaufort County in the years between 1848 and 1859, following routes that one man had spent years mapping with the thoroughness of someone who understood that a single wrong turn, a single miscalculation of the tide, a single moment of being seen, would end not just his own project, but everyone who depended on it. The arrangement with Cornelius Hargrove, the exchange of information for latitude, the trade of financial intelligence for the specific freedom of nighttime movement, was, in retrospect, a structure of remarkable delicacy. Two men in a relationship defined entirely by power and ownership had reached, through a combination of leverage and calculation, an agreement that served interests that neither of them could fully acknowledge to the other. Cornelius received information useful to his business. Elias received the time and access he needed to build what he had come to the Hargrove estate to build. Whether Cornelius knew, fully, explicitly, what Elias was doing with the marsh roots is a question that Eleanor's diary raises and does not answer. The diary suggests he suspected. It suggests that the November 1857 conversation, after Garner's appearance at the gate, was the moment when both men acknowledged without complete candor what the arrangement had actually been. And it suggests that Cornelius's instruction, "Let it go," was not the response of a man who had been deceived, but of a man who had, over 12 years, arrived at a position that was complicated in ways he could not articulate and had decided not to try. The Henderson account itself, the original leverage, was never fully exposed. It surfaced once, briefly, in an 1862 legal dispute over the Hargrove estate's wartime obligations, and the reference in that case file is the most explicit documentary evidence of its existence. The man named Dutton, the factor in Charleston whose name appears in Eleanor's diary in the context of Cornelius's financial dealings, died in 1863, and whatever records he kept did not survive the city's wartime disruptions. The routes through the Beaufort Marsh were used in various forms for years after Elias departed. The tidal crossings he had mapped remained viable. Other people, in the years of the war and after, navigated them. Whether they navigated them because of knowledge he had left behind, passed on through Ruth or Ada or others whose names are not in any surviving record, is not something that can be verified. It is the kind of question that the surviving documents approach obliquely and then leave alone. Bertram Voss, the overseer who found Elias at the field's edge in September of 1847, who first brought him to Cornelius, who spent 12 years logging his nighttime movements in the margins of his work reports, and then simply stopped, left the Hargrove property in January of 1859, 2 months before the ledger was found. The circumstances of his departure are described in Henry Hargrove's estate records only as mutual agreement. There is a single payment noted in those records made to Voss on the date of his departure that is approximately 5 times his monthly wage. Its stated purpose is listed as settlement of services. No other explanation is provided. There is a question that sits at the center of this story, quiet and persistent, the way certain questions do when the people who could answer them are gone. Elias came to the Hargrove estate in 1847 as a purchased man. Bought at auction in Savannah, origin unknown. The auction record gives his occupation as general field labor, which, given everything that followed, was either a profound mischaracterization or a deliberate concealment. The knowledge he carried with him, of the Henderson account, of the roots, of the particular leverage he used in that first September night conversation, did not arrive with him fully formed. It had to have been learned somewhere. It had to have been part of a plan that preceded his arrival. The auction record does not say who sold him. It does not say where he came from. It gives an estimated age and nothing else. What it does not answer is the question of how a man arrives at a particular plantation in a particular county, already in possession of the specific knowledge needed to leverage its owner, already oriented toward the specific geography needed to build the routes he built, already knowing that the thing he was building would take years and require the patience and the endurance of someone who has accepted in advance the full weight of the cost. It does not answer that question because auction records were not designed to record that kind of thing. They were designed to record prices. The Hargrove estate was sold in 1866, after the war, as part of the Sea Islands land redistribution efforts under federal policy. The main house stood until 1891, when it burned in a fire whose cause was listed in the county record as undetermined. The tool building, the small outbuilding that had been Elias's home for 12 years, was demolished at some point before 1880. The marsh is still there. The tidal grass still moves the way it moved when a man named Elias walked through it on winter nights with a lamp turned low and his feet finding the dry path through the water with the certainty of someone who had committed every inch of it to memory. If this story stayed with you, if the question of what Elias knew and when he knew it and what it cost him and what he chose to do with that cost kept you in your seat until the last word, then leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from. Stories like this one deserve to be heard. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, share this with someone who loves the deep, dark corners of history. We'll see you in the next one.